Do you think silence in a family says more than shouting?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I was never the generous one in my family, even though that is exactly how they liked to describe me in public. I was the bank. I was the card that never got declined, the quiet backup plan no one had to admit they depended on. The interest they owed me was not cash, it was respect, and it was the one thing they never thought they had to pay. Christmas dinner was supposed to be the one time of year when everyone behaved, at least on the surface, but that illusion cracked the second I heard Aunt Linda laugh and say, "He's basically our ATM." She said it like I was not even in the room, like my entire identity in the family had boiled down to the person who picked up the checks and made problems disappear with a swipe of plastic. She even mixed up my pronouns, which somehow made it sting more, like I was an appliance instead of her niece. I felt my stomach tighten, but I kept my face straight because I knew better than to show any reaction in that moment. My instinct was to pretend I had not heard, let the evening drag on, and swallow the insult like I had swallowed so many little digs before. But this time was different, and I knew it. The funny part is that I had already paid for half the evening before we even sat down. I booked the reservation because nobody else wanted to deal with deposits around the holidays, and I had covered the appetizer platters that were waiting on the table because apparently it's tradition for me to handle that. I never called it tradition, but that was the word Aunt Linda liked to throw around whenever my money was involved. Everyone smiled at me when we arrived, thanking me for making things so smooth, and for a split second I almost believed they appreciated me for me. Then came the laugh, the ATM comment, and the realization that all the appreciation was just a mask they wore until the food was served. When the check finally landed, I could feel the entire table shift in my direction without anyone saying a word. It was automatic, like a muscle memory they had rehearsed for years. Uncle Rick pulled out his reading glasses, but made no move for his wallet. My mom gave me that look that says, "Just do it and avoid the fight," and my dad cleared his throat the way he always does when he is uncomfortable but unwilling to step in. It was a script I knew by heart, and I was tired of playing my part. So I stood up, not with anger, not with some dramatic speech, but with the kind of calm that comes from finally being done. I looked at the server, smiled politely, and said, "Handle it yourselves." Then I sat back down. For the first time in my life, I watched their faces when the script was broken. Aunt Linda blinked fast like she had not understood the words. Uncle Rick coughed into his hand and muttered about forgetting his wallet in the car. My mom whispered that I should not make a scene, and my dad said under his breath that it was Christmas, not a courtroom. The server looked confused, eyes flicking between me and the others, and that is when Aunt Linda tried to pull her usual trick. She waved the manager over and told him the reservation was under my card, so of course I would be paying. She said it loud enough for the entire section of the restaurant to hear, as if public pressure could force me back into the role. The manager looked directly at me and asked, "Should I run it?" I felt every eye at the table lock on me, waiting for me to cave. I took a slow breath, kept my voice steady, and said, "No," that was it. Just one word, but it changed everything. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Aunt Linda's smile froze. Uncle Rick shifted in his seat like he was calculating how much cash he had left in his pocket, and my mom started rambling about how the holidays are stressful for everyone. The manager nodded, completely professional, and placed the check back on the table. The numbers were right there in black and white, and for once, they were not my problem. I leaned back, folded my hands in my lap, and watched. It was almost surreal to see my family, the people who never hesitated to remind me of tradition, suddenly scramble when the bill was in front of them with no escape hatch. I could see panic on a few faces, irritation on others, and then something I had not seen in years: accountability. That was the moment I realized I had been carrying a weight they never even acknowledged. And now, finally, I had put it down. The best part? I did not raise my voice, I did not storm out. I did not explain or justify a single thing. I simply refused to play the role they had written for me. And as the check sat there untouched, the tension at the table rose higher and higher until I could practically hear the cracks forming in the story they had all told themselves for years. What none of them knew, though, was that this was just the beginning. I had more than a word up my sleeve. I had receipts, memories, and a quiet resolve that was not going away. They thought the worst part of the night was the bill, but they had no idea what was coming next. Can you guess how they reacted once they realized I meant every word? Because let me tell you, their faces alone were worth every penny I did not spend. That night did not end when I walked out of the restaurant with my coat over my arm and my chin still up, because the rail noise moved to the place where my family feels safest throwing stones, which is the group chat they name something corny about togetherness and uses mostly to coordinate meals I am expected to cover, and within minutes of me getting home the notifications began to pile up like receipts on a kitchen counter, with Aunt Linda leading the charge about how I had embarrassed everyone, Uncle Rick typing a whole paragraph about holiday spirit and generosity that somehow never includes his own wallet, my mother telling me to call her immediately because she cannot sleep when people are upset, and my father dropping his familiar line about not turning small problems into big ones even though he knows very well that this is not a small problem and has not been one for years. I read every message before I wrote a single word, because I did not want to respond with heat when what the situation needed was clarity, and while they went back and forth in a chorus of guilt and deflection, I opened my banking app, searched the last 12 months, and pulled every transfer that had gone out to this family under labels like emergency. I will pay you Friday, just this once, and we will settle after the holiday. Then I copied the reference lines into a note where I could see the pattern, which looked exactly like I feared it would look, a slow bleed disguised as kindness, and I decided that if they wanted to talk about embarrassment, we could instead talk about meth. When I finally answered, I did not swing at anyone and I did not write a speech. I sent one calm message that said I would reply in the morning with details so no one would misremember the past, and then I put my phone face down and made tea. Because for the first time in a long time I felt like the adult in the room, and adults do not argue at midnight in a chat thread when they can prepare and make their point once, cleanly, and without apology. In the morning I typed a message that was longer than anything I had sent to that chat in years, not because I wanted to flood them with words, but because I wanted zero room for misinterpretation. And I started by saying that I had no interest in punishing anyone, that I was changing my participation in a pattern that had made me resentful and had made them careless, that I was not anyone's bank, and that the tradition they kept referencing was not a tradition but a habit formed by silence. And then I attached a tidy list of dates and amounts that covered deposits for family rentals, a birthday dinner that Aunt Linda posted about as her treat while I was the one who tipped the staff, and covered the remainder when the card she presented accidentally hit a low limit, a copay for an older relative that I paid without a word because health comes first, and which never came back even after multiple paydays passed, and a handful of transfers that said things like keep the points, which, when you add them up, do not equal fairness. They equal a story that suits everyone but me. Predictably, the first responses avoided the numbers and went straight for my character, because that is easier than looking at a total that makes your stomach drop, and Aunt Linda wrote that families do not keep score and that bringing up money like this is tacky. Then Uncle Rick chimed in that he would have covered more if I had asked directly, which is funny because every past ask was met with the same line about tough seasons and cash flow and the next job just around the corner, and my mother wrote that she wished I had just paid last night and we could have discussed this privately, to which I replied that we have had versions of privately for years and nothing changes when the bill always ends up under my name. Cousin Megan, who usually keeps her head down and sends hearts when she cannot pick a side, sent me a private note that said she had heard the comment about the ATM and that she felt sick because she had laughed at something else in the moment and worried that I thought she laughed at me, and I told her that I did not lump her in with the worst of this, that I understood how rooms can swallow people and that I did not need her to fix anything, just to stop treating my help as inevitable. Because inevitability is where respect goes to die. Once the dust settled a bit, I sent one more message that refused to argue feelings and instead offered a way forward, because I have learned that people are more likely to step into structure than into shame. And I wrote that I had totaled what I had floated over the last year, and that I would send a simple plan with dates that gave everyone breathing room, and that if they agreed by the end of the week I would consider the matter closed with gratitude and would not charge a late fee or interest, or anything that looked like punishment, because what I wanted was not payback in the dramatic sense. It was balance and boundaries so that we could reclaim something like a family without the price tag stapled to my back. The reaction to that was almost comical, because it was as if I had announced a storm warning and half the group decided to debate the weather instead of closing windows, with Aunt Linda insisting that repayment plans are for strangers and that we are blood, which to her apparently means that I should subsidize the performance of generosity she loves to put on display, while my father entered with a rare longer paragraph asking whether we could meet halfway and call the past a wash while committing to splitting things evenly going forward, which would be refreshing if it were not a suggestion I have made in softer language many times before. I thanked my father for the thought and said that going forward we would indeed split evenly or not go out as a group where unevenness is inevitable, and as for the past, I would send the plan that afternoon, because the only way to change a pattern is to change it, not to take it out behind the barn and shoot it with a mercy bullet made of promises. And then I pressed send and felt a familiar wave of nerves roll through me, followed by a steadier feeling I could only call relief, the kind that shows up when you realize you have been volunteering for your own exhaustion. By late afternoon, I had built the plan in plain language with 3 payment dates stretched across a couple of months, each step small enough that no one could claim it was impossible, and I added one line that mattered to me, which said that if payments were missed without communication, I would treat the balance as a formal loan and pursue it through the dullest, least dramatic channel available, because dullness protects sanity, and then I read it twice to make sure there was no heat hiding between the words, attached it to the chat, and told everyone that a simple yes would be enough to start, and that silence would be taken as a no. For a few hours the thread went quiet except for Megan sending a single thumbs up, which is not a word but functioned like one. Then the rest of the evening turned into small side messages where people tested my resolve by asking whether charity would count or whether a holiday gift could be credited, and I answered each one the same way, with a polite sentence that said I appreciated the thought and that the plan was already generous, and if they wanted to give gifts or donate, they were welcome to do that as a separate decision that did not involve me, because mixing kindness with accounting is how we ended up tangled in the first place. Just before midnight, Aunt Linda sent a final message to the group that read like a declaration, claiming that I was turning family into a transaction and that I would never actually push this beyond talk, because I love everyone too much to make things ugly. And I stared at the screen and realized she still did not understand that I was not threatening ugliness, I was inviting honesty, and that I was perfectly willing to do the boring adult thing if they refused the simple path, which is why I typed one calm sentence that said I would take silence as a no and would act accordingly after the deadline. Then I put the phone down and went to bed without checking for replies, because tomorrow I would need energy for the next step. By morning I understood that arguing over intention would only spin all of us back into the same swamp where every promise goes to rot, so I decided to pull this mess onto dry land with something no one could mistake for an attack, which was a clear plan written in plain language that listed what had gone out of my account across the last 12 months, how it would come back in measured steps across a few weeks, and what would happen if those steps did not happen, and as I wrote it I could feel the heat drain from my shoulders, because this was not revenge dressed up as righteousness. It was me finally building a gate where there had always been a revolving door that never stopped spinning as long as I kept pushing it. I drafted a short preface that said I was not punishing anyone and I was not dragging the family into a spectacle, that I was simply declaring the end of a habit that had become invisible to everyone but me, and that I was offering a way to unwind it without humiliation. And then I laid out 3 installments scheduled at sensible intervals with a final line that said, in Kinder words, that silence would count as a no and that a no would move us into a process that might feel cold but would at least be honest. When I posted the plan in the group chat, attaching a tidy 1-page summary that even Uncle Rick could not pretend to misunderstand, the first reply was a short line from my father who said he appreciated the effort and thought it was reasonable. And while I knew he hated conflict and would have preferred we just declared amnesty on the past, I also knew that him calling the plan reasonable mattered, because it meant at least one person in this bloodline could still recognize the difference between fairness and performance, and that acknowledgement steadied me more than I expected. Predictably, Aunt Linda's answer came wrapped in charm with sharp corners, claiming she admired my organization and my heart and that she wished I had come to her privately so she could have done the right thing without paperwork, which I read as an attempt to preserve her public image while avoiding the part where money actually moved, and I told her calmly that privacy has been the setting for years and that nothing changes in private when the bill always lands in my lap in public, and that this plan, while not private, was still discreet and adult and offered her something she had never offered me, which was a clear end date. Uncle Rick tried a different route, pitching what he called store credit in the form of help with errands and projects in the spring, which was generous in theory, but vague enough to vanish the minute we got busy. And I said I appreciated the gesture and that we could happily trade favors going forward once the slate was clean, but that the slate does not clean itself with good intentions and a nod. Because I had tried that for years and all it gave me was a new tradition where I supplied generosity and everyone else supplied applause. My mother called me because she prefers voices over text, and she asked why I was making this feel like a courtroom when holidays should be about grace, and I told her that grace without boundaries is just a long, slow bleed dressed in warm words, and that I loved her enough to say that out loud, even if it made her uncomfortable for a while, because discomfort is not the same thing as harm, and refusing to repeat a harmful pattern is not the same as cruelty, no matter how loudly people who benefited from that pattern insist that I am being unkind. I set a clear timeline that ended on Friday at midnight, not because I like deadlines for the thrill, but because open-ended asks get lost under piles of excuses. And I promised that if they confirmed by Friday, I would waive any late fee I had written into the plan as a soft nudge, and I would send a thank you and never bring up the past again. And that if they declined or ignored it, I would follow up on Monday with a formal notice that would make this official, not dramatic, and would move it out of the family arena where guilt and performance do their best work. To make that promise real to myself, I spent the afternoon gathering what a boring clerk would call supporting documentation, which in my case looked like screenshots of transfers labeled with their own words, reservation emails with the deposit line showing my card, a message thread where Aunt Linda had asked me to cover a shortfall on a birthday dinner she later posted as her treat, and a note from the restaurant manager who kindly sent a sentence confirming that the holiday reservation sat under my name, but no card was left on file, which meant her claim at the table had been theater and nothing else. I did not send the packet yet, because the point was not to humiliate them, the point was to remove the option of pretending this was all in my head, and so I took a quiet walk, came home, reviewed the plan one more time for stray sharpness, and then left the day alone, which felt almost radical after years of reflexively smoothing everyone's discomfort with fast money and forced smiles. The chat went relatively quiet during the week, with small flares of negotiation that I answered with the same steady sentence every time, and for a moment on Thursday afternoon I thought we might actually turn a corner. Because cousin Megan texted that she had talked to her parents and that she believed they were going to do the right thing and that she was proud of me for not yelling and not caving, and I told her that I was not interested in victory laps. Just a fair start line for the next time we all tried to sit at the same table like adults. Friday evening arrived with that particular tightness behind my ribs that shows up when you have given people every chance to be decent and you're about to find out whether decency is something they do when no one is cushioning them. And I cooked myself dinner and let the phone sit across the room so I would not watch the clock bleed down minute by minute, and when I finally picked it up near midnight, I found exactly what I expected and dreaded at the same time, which was a streak of silence. From the people who had the most to say about family and tradition, a polite thumbs up from Megan, a half-typed message bubble from my mother that vanished, and then, with 1 minute left on the clock, a single line from Aunt Linda that landed like a smirk through glass, asking whether I would actually take my own family to court, because surely I was too soft to make things ugly. I stared at that sentence, felt the last of my hesitation dry up like spilled water on a hot day, and answered that I would keep my word exactly as I had written it, which meant she still had 1 minute to say yes, and after that minute I would do the dull, adult, necessary thing on Monday without further announcements, because this was never about ugliness. It was about finally telling the truth with my actions and not just my mouth. When Monday came, I already knew that nothing would magically resolve itself because silence had been their favorite tactic for years, a way of forcing me to keep carrying the load simply because it was easier than demanding accountability. And so instead of waiting for some miraculous gesture, I spent the morning organizing what I had gathered into a small, clear packet that looked less like a threat and more like a straightforward file ready for the dull wheels of small claims court. I included every transfer screenshot, each message where they promised repayment, the restaurant manager's polite note confirming the reservation details, and even a few reminders of deposits I had made to hold cabins and banquet rooms under the pretense of family generosity. When I looked at the packet, it felt strangely clean, not like a weapon, but like a boundary made visible on paper, the kind of thing no one could argue was invented out of hurt feelings, because the proof was laid out in their own words and numbers. Instead of immediately filing, I sent a message to the group chat that was simple and calm, attaching the packet with a note that said this was the evidence I would submit if the repayment plan was ignored, and that I was still leaving them one final window to resolve everything privately and fairly. I wrote that if repayment began this week as outlined, I would consider the matter closed, and that if they refused, then the filing would proceed without further discussion. I did not write it to be dramatic, and I did not lace it with sarcasm. I wrote it like an invoice because that was what it truly was, a long overdue invoice for debts they had pretended were family favors. The silence that followed was different this time, heavier and sharper, as though they all realized that this had moved out of the realm of jokes and guilt and into something they could no longer spin with words. Aunt Linda eventually responded with a line about how disappointed she was that I would drag our name through court filings, trying to reframe the situation as me tarnishing the family reputation rather than her exploiting it. But I refused to answer with anger. Instead, I reminded her that the only reputation at risk was the one she had created by laughing about me being the family ATM, and that I had no intention of hiding that truth anymore. Because truth cannot be more embarrassing than the behavior that caused it. While the group argued in fragments, I made a decision that would hit them in a place they could not twist into generosity theater. For years I had poured hundreds into the performance of holiday meals and family gestures that were presented as collective love, but funded almost entirely by me. And this year I redirected that entire budget into a donation in my grandmother's name to the local shelter she used to support. I sent the receipt into the chat with a note that said this was where my holiday gift had gone, because Grandma taught me real generosity, and I believed she would approve. That move did not just reframe the holiday, it also stripped away their ability to claim that I had ruined Christmas by refusing to foot the bill, because I had honored the one person in the family who had truly given without taking. And I had done it in a way that was both public and untouchable. Aunt Linda tried to reclaim the stage by posting a photo of her own table with a caption about family first, clearly aimed at showing that she was still the generous matriarch, but I did not let it pass. I answered once, not with venom, but with a single sentence, always, which is why I finally said stop. That was all I needed to say, because anything more would have turned into another spiral of words they could twist, and brevity in that moment carried more weight than paragraphs ever could. That night I got a call from cousin Megan, her voice trembling, saying she had stumbled on old messages between her parents and some of the uncles where they bragged about getting me to cover large tabs, even joking about how I never noticed the difference because I had a good salary and no children, and she said she could not keep quiet anymore. She asked if I wanted her to send them, and I paused because I knew this would be crossing into a new stage, one where their private words would be used to show just how deliberate the pattern had been. I told her to send them, not because I needed more ammunition, but because I wanted the truth to sit in their own handwriting, undeniable and permanent. When the screenshots arrived, I read them slowly, and while part of me burned with humiliation, another part of me felt vindicated, because here was the proof that it was never about accidents or forgetfulness. It was about entitlement cloaked in laughter. The words were casual, almost smug, about how easy it was to let me cover the balance, how they could count on me not to make a fuss, and even one line from Aunt Linda saying, "She gets points, so it's basically free for her." That one sentence crystallized years of resentment because it showed that they had rewritten my sacrifice into some kind of personal bonus, as though miles and cash back equaled the thousands I had poured out while they smiled and toasted their own generosity. Holding those screenshots in my hand, I realized the reputation arc had shifted entirely, because for years the story in the extended family had been that I was generous, and they were grateful, but now the real story could not be hidden anymore. And the more they tried to spin it, the more foolish they would look. I did not even need to send the screenshots to the group immediately, because the simple fact that Megan had shared them meant the story was already leaking within the bloodline, and reputation, once cracked, does not repair itself with denial. I slept that night with the packet on my desk, the donation receipt pinned above it, and the screenshots sitting in my phone, and I knew that whatever came next, the ground had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. My family had built a story about me as the ATM, the dependable one who would never say no, but by the end of that day I had replaced their story with mine, and mine was not cruel, it was simply final. The only question left was whether they would understand the cost of trying to keep the old script alive, because the bill had come due in more ways than one, and I had no intention of forgiving the debt with silence ever again. By the time the week turned over and the sun came up on the day I had promised to act, I had already made peace with the idea that doing the boring, adult, completely unglamorous thing might be the most powerful decision I had made in years, because power, as it turns out, does not always look like a speech or a slammed door. Sometimes it looks like filling out a form carefully, attaching screenshots that tell their own story without any spin, and walking it to a clerk who will stamp it with a date that means this is now real whether anyone likes it or not. And as I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the packet one last time, I reminded myself that the point was not to win some dramatic showdown that would get retold at reunions. The point was to end a pattern that had trained me to accept responsibility for other people's choices while calling it love. I sent one final message that morning to Aunt Linda and Uncle Rick privately, not to shame them or bait them, but to put the exact truth on the record in the plainest language I could manage, which said that I had their messages in which they joked about getting me to cover the balance, that I had the year of transfers with their own notes attached, that I had a repayment plan they had ignored after being given more time and grace than most strangers would receive, and that I was now moving forward because I keep my word to myself even when it makes me the unpopular one in the family. An hour later, which felt less like coincidence and more like habit, a partial repayment hit my account with a note that called me dramatic for taking things so far over what they described as misunderstandings. And while a softer version of me might have seen that deposit as proof that progress was possible and let the rest slide for the sake of quiet, the version of me who had finally learned to distinguish peace from silence read that note as the last attempt to set the terms on their schedule, and I decided that gentle was not the same as weak and that I could be gracious while still being firm, so I replied with 2 words that said everything necessary, which were thank you, and then I filed for the remaining balance without another round of debate. Because the difference between fairness and theater is follow-through, and I had finally become someone who follows through for herself, not just for everyone else. Filing the paperwork did not feel like revenge in the cinematic sense people crave when they picture justice. It felt like choosing a lane where guilt and charm cannot interfere, and as I walked out of the building with a stamped copy in my bag, I realized that the knot in my chest that I had once thought was permanent had loosened to the point of being a memory, which is when I decided to do something that seemed small on the surface and yet carried a kind of private weight for me, and that was to text cousin Megan and invite her to coffee at a place without any of the family history layered into the walls, because she had stepped across a line to bring me the truth even though it cost her comfort. And I wanted to acknowledge that not every person with our last name had chosen the easy story. Over cups that cooled more quickly than either of us wanted, she apologized again for what she had found and for what she had not confronted earlier, and I told her that apology is a nice word. But change is the only one that moves anything forward, so if she wanted to do something that mattered, she could stop joining the chorus whenever someone tried to frame my boundaries as cruelty. And she nodded with that shaky exhale people make when they are relieved to hear a clear assignment rather than an ocean of resentment. The next family gathering came sooner than I expected because there is always a reason to assemble when people want to test whether consequences have actually changed a dynamic. And I went because hiding would have handed the stage back to the same performances that built this mess, and I arrived without gifts packed as apologies, and without the kind of smile that begs for permission to exist. And I took a seat at the far end of the table next to Megan, who squeezed my hand once as if to say, she understood that this was not victory chest beating but a new baseline. Predictably, Aunt Linda opened the evening with a speech aimed at recentering her version of events, which sounded like a string of phrases about family and forgiveness and moving on, and just when I felt the familiar tug to defend myself point by point, the manager from the Christmas restaurant walked by our table carrying a tray, paused, and offered a warm nod with a simple "good to see you," which landed like a quiet gavel. Because he was the one neutral witness who had seen the beginning of this turn, and his presence, without any narrative attached, made Aunt Linda's voice catch in a way I had never heard before. I did not seize the moment with a monologue, and I did not pass around the screenshots like party tricks, because I had already made the choice to keep the money conversation in the only arena where words do not get to reinvent themselves. And that choice freed me to say exactly one thing when she finished her speech and scanned the room for consensus, which was that I am not your ATM, that you did not lose a bank, you lost an assumption, and that going forward I would pay for myself or for no one, and that if anyone felt uncomfortable with that boundary, then they were free to plan their nights without me, because absence costs less than resentment, and I am done subsidizing the story where my worth is measured in receipts. The room went still in that way families go still when they realize the lever they always pulled has been welded in place, and a few seconds later the conversation restarted on a different track. And it amazed me how quickly a table can relearn basic arithmetic when the old shortcut is gone, because suddenly people were comparing menu prices and suggesting a split and checking their balances without the performative giggling that used to pass for planning, and it was not elegant or generous or pretty, but it was honest, which is the only way anything heals. In the days that followed, the small claims notice made its way to the right mailboxes, and the texts I received ranged from annoyed to conciliatory to oddly affectionate, like they were trying on different tones to see which one would make me back down. And I answered each with the same calm line that I was glad to see the conversation changing, and that the filing was not personal, it was procedural, and that once the balance was settled I would consider the matter closed without a single extra word. Because punishment had never been the point. The point was removing access to my compliance. When the payment finally cleared, which it did sooner than anyone would have bet a month earlier, I sent one last message to the group chat that said thank you for closing the loop and that going forward I would not be participating in group arrangements unless the split was agreed in writing ahead of time. And I meant in writing the practical way of a confirmation message, not some legal form. Because clarity is free, and it saves everyone from the fog where old habits breed. What surprised me most was not the money landing where it should have been all along, but the internal quiet that replaced the constant background hum of resentment I had trained myself to ignore, a quiet that felt like the absence of performance, the absence of managing other people's comfort so they would keep liking me, the absence of building my sense of belonging on how quickly I could pick up a check, and while there were still looks and whispers and a few relatives who chose distance over adjustment, I accepted that consequence as the price of finally stepping out of a role I never auditioned for, because the ending I wanted was not applause, it was control of my time, my money, and my name. I walked out of the next dinner holding only my own bill, paid it without thinking twice, and left with my head clear, knowing that even if some questions would linger about whether they would ever truly get it, the core truth was settled, which was that I had won by refusing to keep the game running, and that the brilliance, if anyone needed a label for it, was not in a sting or a spectacle, it was in teaching them that access to me is no longer the same thing as access to my resources, and that lesson will outlast any holiday toast they try to give in my honor.